Hong. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Asian Americans Network. Today's event is total for 1 hour. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions for the speaker, or if you want to echo or make a comment. We will invite you to the stage. Please wait your turn and mute your microphone while other speakers is talking. So please follow us by clicking the greenhouse beside the club name. You will get the event detail information after we post it each time. So this event is presented by Silicon Valley Innovation Channel, Dingding TV, and the Mentoring Club. So about the Dingding TV, in the past 12 years, we have been focusing on build branding for the customer and any industry related innovation, and connecting entrepreneurs and the mental captures. So we host more than 80 events every year. We also have a 4,000 square feet professional studio for rent in Santa Clara. So please contact us if you are interested. So this is Sandy, I'm done speaking. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Lisa to introduce the mentoring club. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy, and good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to everyone. I am Lisa Mendoza, and I'm the founder of the Mentoring Club. Thank you for this partnership with Hong, Diana, and Sandy. So let me just give you a little bit of background about the Mentoring Club. We are a nonprofit organization, 501c3, and our mission is to provide a mentoring community for aspiring and seasoned leaders, so that anywhere in the world, we can help working people find mentors who can guide them to develop the skills they need to achieve their career and life goals. We help mentees fulfill their goals through meaningful work that creates positive impact in the world. Long term, our vision is that as mentees become leaders, that our dream for them is to become mentors to others. So if you know of people who are wanting to give back through mentoring, become mentors, and people who are looking for mentors, please send them my way, and I'd be happy to help them out through our mentoring community. Thank you. Back to you, Hong, Sandy.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. Yes. With that, I will introduce Rosemary and the topic for tonight. And we will start out with just a conversation I will have with Rosemary, just to set the topic, and then in the second half of the session tonight, I will open up and follow the mic sequence and invite everybody to join us and participate, and share your point of view or ask any questions to Rosemary or to anyone else for that matter. Yes, we will invite everyone to the stage and to participate. You don't have to, certainly, although to join in the conversation. So the topic for tonight is global supply chains and pandemic prices. So you have noticed it, and the statistics are published, are public. In May this year, the US Consumer Price Index rose 5%. That's a 13-year record high. The biggest reason was shortage of computer chips from contract manufacturers in Asia, and that impacted things like cars, new cars, and as well as used cars. Car prices continue to rise, and experts are predicting that will continue until 2023, past next year. So supply chain problems and possible solutions have become global, completely global, and quite complex. So this pandemic has made that point really out and clear. Our speaker tonight, Rosemary Coates, is an expert, and she's an expert witness as well on this topic, and a bestseller of and author of multiple books on the topic, with 30 years of experience in global supply chain, procurement, logistics, and manufacturing. She is the founder and president of Blue Silk Consulting and the founder and executive director of the Reshoring Institute. Welcome, Rosemary.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, at this point, I'd like to ask you if you can have your own self-introduction in case I missed something, and maybe like a short opening statement before I dive into a number of questions that I have prepared.
Sure. As you mentioned, I've been doing this for a very long time. I've been a management consultant for the past 25 years. Prior to that, I worked for Hewlett Packard and SAP. So I look at the global supply chains through the lens of process improvement as well as implementation of software that can assist. I have, as Hong mentioned, written 5 books on supply chain management, starting off with one that's called 42 Rules for Sourcing and Manufacturing in China. So I spent quite a few years helping companies move their manufacturing to China or their sourcing or setting up operations there. Spent lots of time in China. And then about 7 years ago, during the presidential election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, they were both pointing to China and saying China was causing us all this problem and it was all China's fault. And here I am, helping all these companies move to China. So it was a little tough time to get through. But what happened after that election and Barack Obama became president was that a lot of companies started talking about or thinking about their global supply chains and where in the world could they actually manufacture, and even the possibility of bringing some manufacturing back to the U.S. So as a management consultant, we're talking to clients all the time, and as a result of those kind of discussions, we started the Reshoring Institute. The Reshoring Institute is a consulting firm, but also a research firm. We provide research and assistance to companies that are bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. And we have a dual mission. The other one is to educate graduate students from universities across America on the world of global manufacturing. So now we have affiliations with 14 universities. We take interns and they help us with our projects as well as our research, and we publish all of the research that they write for us. Everything's available on our website. So those are the 2 businesses. My original consulting firm is Blue Silk Consulting and the Reshoring Institute. And then the third aspect of what I do, as Hong mentioned, is I do quite a bit of work as an expert witness. So I get involved in legal cases that involve global supply chains, often related to Chinese manufacturing or some dispute between people that are in supply chain. And then I get engaged as an expert witness and I assist with those kind of cases. So I've been doing that for quite a while too, and have worked on about 40 legal cases covering global supply chains. So that keeps me pretty busy, those 3 things.
Yes, I think with the pandemic, most businesses have suffered with a few flourishing, and Rosemary's business is one of those that just flourish. I would say to the expense of anybody else, but all right. With that, I do have a couple of questions that I have prepared, so we can set the topic, the range and of the topics, so that we can open up for everybody to chime in. So my first question to Rosemary is the following: what have we learned during this pandemic about global supply chains? What are the problems?
That's a very interesting question, and one that's certainly front and center in the topic every day. We just finished a study for the state of New York, and we were asked by New York to interview 50 companies, 50 manufacturing companies, and asked them how they fared through the pandemic, what were their issues, what were the best practices, and what will they do in the future differently. And that was it was a very interesting study. In fact, we just did the final presentation this morning. And what we found was a lot of companies that did well during the pandemic were able to sort of become a hybrid of their business. So let me give you an example. We interviewed one company, Ferrara, which is a high-end women's apparel manufacturer. They make clothes for like Jones, New York, and some of the sort of the higher end women's apparel. They also make the uniforms for the U.S. Olympic team and more sophisticated kind of apparel. And when the pandemic hit, their business just fell away. They just didn't. There were just no orders, and so they pivoted and got a government contract and started making PPE gowns in New York City that were in very short supply. And as a result of that, they made PPE gowns for 6 months and did extremely well during that period. So, that's, I think, a good example of a company that was very, very flexible and did well. What was interesting, too, is we did as part of this, we interviewed these companies. We also did a survey. And what the findings were that nearly 50% of the companies we surveyed said they did much better during the pandemic in terms of revenues, which surprised me a lot. And only 27% said they didn't fare very well, that they lost money during the pandemic. The rest of them were even and didn't have an issue. But wow, 50% of the companies did better, which was just astonishing to me. So I think you have to. It depends on your perspective and your look at the world. A couple of things that stood out. A lot of the companies that did better had chosen to source in the U.S. So their global supply chains were shorter. So instead of getting all their equipment and raw materials and so forth from China, they at least partially were sourcing in the U.S., which helped them to control their supply chain because, as you know, the supply chains for incoming parts from China were really stuck for 3 or 4 months. There wasn't much at all happening there, and even now there's so much backlog and congestion. It's hard to get products in from overseas. That was a really interesting finding as well.
Great, thanks for sharing that study results with us. Is the study with the Reshoring Institute? Is it available publicly? Just curious.
Yeah, it is with the Reshoring Institute. It's not publicly available yet, but it will be within the next couple of weeks. So we have to take out some names and some individuals and so forth to make it a little bit more generic and then we'll publish the results on our website. So, yeah.
Right.
Everything is published on our website, by the way, all of our research, all the case studies, all of the white papers we do, the surveys that we do, everything is on our website. It's all free and all downloadable. We are a nonprofit organization.
Thanks, Rosemary. And for those who join us tonight, if you click on my profile, you will see that I have the link to the Reshoring Institute, so you can go there. Great, thanks so much. I'm going to ask a different question, just so we can lay out the spread, the variety of what can be covered tonight with Rosemary. So, did the pandemic create the supply chain problems we are encountering, or were those problems that were bound to happen anyway? Are these problems that were bound to happen anyway that just surfaced with the pandemic, or are they specific to the pandemic?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I'm not exactly sure how to answer it because there's so many moving parts. So first of all, we live in a globalized world. I mean, there's no going back. We're all part of the world now. 30 years ago, 25 years ago, we were just starting to look at different companies on the internet. Today, you know, at the drop of the hat, you just go and search on something in China and you find it, right? And it wasn't like that not that long ago. So, I mean, we are not only have global supply chains and economies that are interconnected, but you know, we have matured and evolved to become a global economy, and there isn't any going back. The difference now, I think, is that companies are thinking more strategically. So a lot of companies are now considering the strategy of what we call China Plus One, and that's where they manufacture in China, but then plus one other country, maybe Mexico or Vietnam, or even bringing back some manufacturing to the U.S. So that's really changed. Now, the pandemic, excuse me, the pandemic itself really made a big difference. So, you know, we had a few things happen over the past years. In 2017, the U.S. Congress passed the Tax Reform Act, and it lowered the tax rate for manufacturers down from 29% down to 21%. And that was supposed to drive all this manufacturing back. There's all this hype by the Trump administration. You know, all this manufacturing is going to come back. And pretty much nothing happened. The companies took the tax break, but they didn't add to their manufacturing or bring anything back. It was sort of a failure in terms of not bringing anything back. And then the trade wars, the Trump trade wars, you know, the 301 tariffs on Chinese imports, the 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel. Oh, you know, that was supposed to bring all this manufacturing back, and all these manufacturers are going to flood back into the U.S. and because the tariffs were so expensive on imports, and pretty much nothing happened. We just paid more for imports, that's all. And that was passed on to American consumers. But the pandemic introduced risk, and that's different from an economic perspective. So once companies recognize that there is risk and vulnerability in these global supply chains, that's when we started really seeing a return to the U.S. And we're pretty busy right now. A lot of companies are thinking much more strategically about what they're doing, how they're doing it, where are their manufacturing operations, where are their growth economies. So, you know, we work with companies that are really thinking that way about their strategic view. We don't advocate that you bring everything back to the U.S. I think that's silly. It's not realistic, and it doesn't make sense. And if you're looking at growth markets across Asia, you know, 10 to 12%, and that's your growth market for the future, it doesn't make sense to take all your manufacturing out of Asia. You should still be there, and in China in particular. But you also may want to address your risk and your vulnerabilities by bringing some manufacturing and some sourcing closer to home. So, you know, companies are following a more sophisticated strategy these days.
Great, thanks. Staying a little bit on that particular dimension of globalization. So manufacturing has become quite specialized and globalized, and you're saying that it will remain so. What has led manufacturing to have become so specialized and especially so globalized?
Well, I think, you know, when China rose to the WTO, when it ascended to the WTO in 2001, what happened was there were all kinds of restrictions prior to that. There were visa requirements and quotas and all sorts of crazy stuff on imports from China prior to 2001. But when China joined the WTO, it required China and other countries to be more open in terms of trade. So the U.S., for example, dropped quota requirements and visa requirements on a lot of goods. So now you could import more than you could before. And also, you know, China opened its doors to foreign investment. And because it was a very low cost environment, many companies moved their manufacturing there. It made sense to take advantage of the low cost of labor, the low cost of operations. And with the WTO and evened out import tariff rates, it was overall a very positive move economically. But today, the world has evolved. The global economies are different. China is not so much the best low cost environment anymore. There are other countries that have even lower costs. So if you have a lot of labor content in what you're producing, you need lots of people, then you need to go to a lower cost environment. If you can automate your production, extract the labor costs, then you have options to look at different places, including the US. So that, it's a different strategy. I don't know if I answered your question or
Yes.
not. Okay.
Absolutely. Yes. I'm trying to establish the range of topics that people can bring up in the second half. Very shortly, for that matter. Yeah. So 2 more questions that I have prepared. Next to last is this one. So it seems to me that for companies, big, large-scale companies, operations leadership has become procurement leadership, right? With so many things offshore. To manufacturing overseas and sourcing and be on top of the whole network of manufacturers, component manufacturers all over the world. So so scaling of production means that operations leadership now has really become synonymous to procurement leadership. Is that correct? What's the implication? Is that correct, first of all, and what's the implication of that? Do companies become forever more, do industries become forever more concentrated now, for example?
Yes. So let's take Apple, for example. So, Apple doesn't produce anything. I don't know if everyone's aware of that, but they don't make anything. It's 100% outsourced. And they use contract manufacturers. So you can kind of categorize that as procuring contract manufacturing, all the way down to companies that are simply procuring parts. So, there's a wide, and you can look at it from that perspective that it's all about procurement, really. And there's less companies that are establishing full-blown operations, and instead they hire a contract manufacturer to make stuff for them in different countries. So that, that is sort of a crossover way of thinking it. It's not exactly putting manufacturing in one box and procurement in another box. It's sort of blended together as a result. And this to me is part of the whole globalization movement. So looking at where the world can use source goods or establish a contract manufacturer and why is the questions that are being asked at the executive level these days. Back when I started working a long time ago, 35 years ago, 40 years ago, it was all, logistics, supply chain, procurement. I mean, nobody talked about supply chain back then. That wasn't a word that was invented until the 80s. But people were, talking about these things in little buckets. So there was no kind of integrated thinking about all of it. And you looked for just where could you get the most efficiencies or the lowest cost or that sort of thing. Today, it's a whole strategic thought process, and executives in supply chain have reached the C-suite. So now, supply chain people have risen to the level of the executives. And instead of manufacturing operations being an afterthought, now it's integrated into the executive leadership teams. And in fact, may be the leader. So, it is all about your company. If you take Apple, for example, it's all about moving goods around the world. I mean, that's such an important part of their business. sourcing, manufacturing, moving goods to market, and so forth. That's an essential part of their business. They're designing things and running the operations from Cupertino, but their operations are very global in nature, and that's I think a good example of what we talk about when we're discussing globalization.
Right. Thanks again. And last opening question now. So at this stage, right, as we are looking to get back to normal, quote unquote, whatever that means and whenever that comes. So what now, as we are coming out of the pandemic, where are we, and what should we be expecting in the next months or going into 2021, 2022? What should we be expecting?
Well, I think from a manufacturing perspective, there's a couple of things that we're definitely going to see. So one of them is companies that are sourcing closer to home, whether you're in China and you're sourcing from Chinese manufacturers, or you're in the US and you're trying to source from US manufacturers. We're going to see a movement in that direction. In fact, Thomas.net, which is a platform for manufacturers of all kinds of parts. They're a huge company and a huge platform where buyers go to find if they need a screw or they need a housing or they need a harness. You know, they would go to Thomas.net or Thomas.com now it is to find a supplier and connect up with them. So you know, it's possible to find potential suppliers that are in the US to serve US manufacturers. And I think we're going to see a movement in that direction. And Thomas did a study about a year ago, and they surveyed like 5,000 industrial buyers across the US. And they indicated that they plan to source 10% or so more of their products in the US than they did in last year. So that 10%, sourcing 10% more, just, you know, it's a fairly small percentage of what they buy, translates to $443 billion injected into our economy, into local US manufacturers that are making those parts. So it's just jaw-dropping awesome what an effect that could have on the US when companies start sourcing. So I think we're going to see some movement there. The other thing that's pretty big is, you know, most big companies have been practicing lean, L-E-A-N, lean manufacturing for some time, and it's pervasive across all kinds of processes. It's not just in manufacturing, but lots of companies adopt lean techniques which optimize or they get rid of non-value-added processes in your company. So you can practice lean in your your accounting department, or in your manufacturing department, or your planning department, or purchasing. So these principles apply everywhere, and they're simply to simplify processes and take away anything that isn't value-added. And a lot of companies practice lean in their manufacturing. And by that I mean they kept inventory, work in process, and inventory in transit at a minimum. So they were getting shipments in just in time. So if I need something for production tomorrow, I might have the parts delivered today. So it was a constant movement in pipelines to get products just in time. And we saw that idea really falter during the pandemic. I mean, all of a sudden, there wasn't enough PPE and we couldn't get it anywhere. There wasn't enough toilet paper and we couldn't get it anywhere. There weren't any Clorox wipes and Lysol wipes. And that's because most companies were practicing lean ideas, meaning they were delivering products just in time. I think as a result of the pandemic, we're going to see more companies that are going to build inventory. So instead of practicing lean, they're going to build inventory so they actually have more raw materials and products stockpiled somewhere in a warehouse, so they're not so vulnerable. The Hyundai automotive plant in Seoul, Korea, was making Hyundai's cars as the automotive center in China, sort of the Detroit of China. And within a week of shutting down Wuhan, the Hyundai plant in Korea had to shut down because they couldn't get parts. You know, there was one headline I saw that said, you can't make a car with 3 wheels. So, and because they had shortages of parts all over the place, they had a lot of half-built cars where they just didn't have the rest of the parts. You know, we're seeing that in semiconductors today. That's another big area where we were kind of moving along, and there were really significant shortages in semiconductors in 2019. But when the pandemic hit and so many people and kids, children, were working from home or going to school remotely, the demand for laptop computers went through the roof. It just skyrocketed. And as a result of that, because so many people were buying laptop computers, the semiconductor manufacturers switched over and started supplying chips to computer manufacturers and less chips to automotive, for example, because at least the first 6 months, nobody was buying cars. And, you know, the automotive industry really suffered. But now, because there was no production, there wasn't enough production for things like automobiles and other equipment. Now we've got the shortage everywhere, and it's horrendous. You know, I saw an ad on TV the other day or it wasn't an ad, it was a news report where they were interviewing a man that owned a car lot, and he said, you know, by this time every year, September, October, they have 300 or 400 new cars, new models on the lot. This year they have 12. And it's simply because they can't get any new cars, and they can't get any new cars because there are shortages in semiconductors. But, you know, that's a good example of the global supply chain also. Are you there?